Welcome back to our Clear Tuition series in preparation for the external exam, specifically in support of our study of the play Macbeth. So in this little tutorial, I want to talk to you very briefly about the context of the play. So a little bit of an understanding of the era in which the play was written, what was happening in England at the time, and why it is that Shakespeare might have written the play that he's written. Now, everything I'm going to say here is only the briefest of the details, and as is always the case in this unit, it is strongly recommended that you read around the text, that you do your own reading to really develop your understanding of who's who in the zoo and how that might be relevant to the play. Okay, so important thing to note to start. Shakespeare has not written a play about a king. Okay, he's written a play about a man, about a human being with human weaknesses and human strengths. However, he wrote for an audience at the time that had enjoyed far less in the way of formal education than you have now. And it was important that he used imagery that his audience would understand. And so in light of the fact that England had recently been succeeded on the throne by a new king, and that king had come with a whole lot of controversy, it made sense for Shakespeare to use a story about a king as something that people would already have prior knowledge of. Okay, so why Macbeth? So Macbeth is the story of a Scottish king. And when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth in about 1606, the English throne had just been inherited by a gentleman by the name of James, who was James I of England, but he was already a Scottish king, and he had been James IV of Scotland, and he had come to the throne in 1603. Now, if you know anything about English history, the English throne, particularly around this era, was a little bit complicated. So let's step back a couple of generations. Prior to James I taking the throne, England had been led by Queen Elizabeth I. She is famously known as the Virgin Queen because in order to preserve the sovereignty of her own rule, she refused to get married. Her belief was that if she had married a king, a prince, that he would ultimately outrank her. And so that rather than tear her country in half as people try to decide whether they were loyal to an English queen or loyal to a king, as they always had been, she chose not to marry at all. Now, this is a little bit of a curly problem because the fact that she was on the throne already was problematic. Her father is King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII famously had 6 wives, and that process of marrying and divorcing and marrying and beheading wives had all occurred to ensure that King Henry VIII had a male heir. So his wives, between his wives, he actually managed to have a number of children. He had daughters, and he did indeed have one son, but that son did not live to adulthood, and as a result, his reign on the throne was actually very shortly lived. As a result, Elizabeth, as his oldest living child, inherited the throne from him. She inherited a throne in a country that was divided by war, whether it was ongoing war with France, war with Spain, war with the Catholic Church, because, of course, King Henry VIII had separated England from the Catholic Church as part of his desire to divorce and remarry. And when Elizabeth died, she left the country without an heir. So when that happens, a country looks to find the nearest living blood relative who might be able to take the throne, and more about why that's important in a minute. Well, Elizabeth I had a cousin whose parentage came from, or grandparentage came from the same place as hers. So her father was King Henry VIII, her grandfather was Henry VII. That's how that works. Mary, Queen of Scots, who you may also have heard of, her grandfather was also Henry VII. So she had a claim to the English throne by blood. She's an interesting character. She had actually, while we call her Mary, Queen of Scots, she had moved to France as a child and had been married to the French king or the French prince, who died quite young in their life, and she was forced to come home and try and find a loyal following in her claim to both the Scottish and the English throne, even though she hadn't lived in Scotland. I mean, she spoke French, among other things. And so her life was plagued with political conspiracies as far as how she could develop allegiances. And what that ultimately resulted in is the birth of her son, James I, who would ultimately go on to rule England. But she was actually forced to abdicate the throne of Scotland to him when he was a 14-month-old baby. So over the course of his childhood, 4 different regents helped rule Scotland in his stead. And when he came to maturity, he had both the ability to inherit the Scottish throne and then ultimately, on the death of Elizabeth, to inherit the English throne. So here we are, we're in England. It's 1606 and Shakespeare is going to write Macbeth. So he's going to write a play about a king who in real life, he's going to write a play about a king. In real life, James I actually claimed that he was descended from the great line of Scottish kings that starts with Banquo. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realise that Banquo is going to be a character central to the play and whose legitimacy as the ruler, as a king, is going to be established, so that when the audiences watch Macbeth, they will also accept that James I has legitimacy on the throne. So Shakespeare begins to write a play about a king. But in order to have a play about a king who is good, we need some complications. So Macbeth, of course, is not the good king. He is, in fact, our antagonist. He's a villain, even though he's the title character of a story. So in presenting him as a villain, we need him to make choices that James I would never make. So let's see what other characters Macbeth might interact with and what that might say about James as a legitimate ruler. So early in Act 1, Macbeth actually interacts with and legitimizes the words of 3 witches. Now, famously, James I was terrified of witches. In fact, early in his reign, just a couple of years before Macbeth was written, he had indeed, there had been an assassination plot against him where the perpetrators were ultimately convicted of witchcraft and put to death. So he lived throughout his entire life in fear of those elements of the then scientific world which could not yet be explained. And as a result, he was really very enthusiastic about the persecution of witches, of anyone who might have been associated with witchcraft. Now, as the longer the witch hunts went on, the more it was that the people who were accused of witchcraft were simply those on the outskirts of society, those who'd been disempowered or disenfranchised by the ruling party. So when we look at our witches at the start of Act 1, we see women who may simply be old, may simply be unmarried. They're widows. They have no legal power. It could be that they are foreign. It could be that they have a disability. So there are lots of different ways that they might have been disempowered. And because of their lack of protection from society, that made them easy targets for an accusation of witchcraft. So, when you're thinking about the witches, think about why it might be that at the start of a play, they are already so hell-bent on making Macbeth's life difficult. Okay, so that's the first point. It's also important to note that, when we look at where the threat comes from, in the case of King Duncan, the threat comes from within. So while it would have been really convenient for the murder of a Scottish king to be blamed on somebody else, the English, for example, or the French or the Norwegian, because that's the country we're at war with at the start of the play, it ultimately comes from within. So at this point, Shakespeare is offering a caution to King James to look out for civil unrest within England rather than assuming that an attack is going to come from outside. And that's important because in 1605, we saw the gunpowder plot. So You might be familiar with the character of history called Guy Fawkes, played by Kit Harington in a movie, if that makes it any easier to connect with. Guy Fawkes wanted to blow up the Houses of Parliament to disrupt the legal proceedings and the judicial proceedings of the country. He hoped to catch the king as the Houses of Parliament were opened for the year. And so he famously stacked a whole lot of barrels of gunpowder in the basement of the Houses of Parliament in an attempt, or in a hope, that he would be able to blow up the Houses of Parliament on the day it opened. Now, that sounds like a great idea, and if he'd kept it to himself, he probably would have been fine. But as it turns out, he shared his plans with a whole bunch of co-conspirators, one of whom was a spy for the king. The plot was uncovered. Guy Fawkes was captured. The gunpowder was removed from the Houses of Parliament, and we celebrate Guy Fawkes Night now with fireworks as a way of commemorating and ridiculing the intention to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So at a point when Shakespeare writes this play, we have already had a king who has descended from the line of Banquo but needs legitimacy in England. We have a king who is terrified of witches and would never listen to anything they said. And we've had a king who has actually already survived an assassination attempt from within his own country. So in telling a story then about the weaknesses that men act on, that people act on, it made sense that Shakespeare told the story of a king, because these were world events, these were national events that the audience members would have understood. Now, because it's also a wonderful story, we have two kings presented as good and evil, so Duncan and Macbeth. We have a range of female characters who help to reinforce maybe some representations of gender that dominate at the time. And by the end of the story, because of the way the story ends, we ultimately recognize that believing in witches is not a good way to go, because the person who believes in witches reaches an unfortunate end, and that the attributes of chivalry, of then masculinity, and of a divine right to rule from the king will all ultimately result in the best outcome for the country. Okay, so in each of these little tutorials, I'm also going to include a terminology list, so a vocab list of words that you need to be able to know and use to analyze the text, and ultimately these will help to improve your credibility as a writer when it comes to actually writing your external exam response. Okay, so let's have a look at the terminology that we particularly want to use when we're talking about the context of this play. Alrighty, so the era in which this play is written is the Jacobean era. So we don't call it the Jamesian or the Jamison era, we call it a Jacobean era. So have a look at the spelling of that. Because it refers to the name of a person, it will always be capitalized, and it refers to the era in which the play is written, not the era in which the actual play Macbeth is set. Okay, so Shakespeare writes in the Jacobean era. I've referenced there the two different nationalities most relevant to this play, the English and the Scottish. And again, these are proper nouns, so they should always be capitalized in your use of them. When you're referring to the style of rule, both the rule of King James and the rules of King Duncan and Macbeth, they are referred to as monarchies. So a monarchy is a system of government where the king is the head of that organisation. Okay, so these next 2 points need a little bit of an explanation, but they're absolutely central to our understanding of why it is that Macbeth's actions are his undoing. All right, so first one is the divine right of kings. So I mentioned the fact that that the king, the line of the succession of the king often passed through bloodline. So there was a belief held in the 1700s or 1600s that the king was God's chosen vessel on earth. all right? And that there was something about that person, that family, that set them apart. And that ultimately was why the throne tended to pass to family members, because if that person was marked as special by God, what was special about them was probably in their blood, and it would pass down to their children. Now, this was a little bit of a curly problem for King Henry VIII. He was God's chosen vessel on earth, but according to the Catholic Church, the Pope was also God's chosen vessel on earth. So that was always going to be a bit of a complication. So when he separated from the Catholic Church in his desire to divorce, he was also able to then legitimize himself as the head of his country and as God's chosen vessel in England. Okay, so ultimately, there is no one on earth with greater power and greater connection to God than the king. Okay, now, linked to the divine right of kings is this idea of the great chain of being. So this was a belief that every living creature on the planet was linked in a great chain, a great series of beings that had different levels of importance. And at the top of that chain comes as no surprise. Well, at the very, very top of the chain, of course, is God. The next top is the king and nobles, lords, and their associated ladies. Then members of the church, lawyers, doctors, merchants, and peasants followed in this great chain. It's important to note that at no place on the great chain do women actually feature. They are secondary to their husbands. They're really counted still amongst the belongings, but they don't have a public voice. So the idea that they need to know where they fit in the hierarchy of society is kind of irrelevant, because they shouldn't, they have husbands or fathers or brothers to do that for them. Why is this important? Because obviously Lady Macbeth has a great deal of power, as do our witches. So if the great chain of being has been preserved, a king is not going to listen to witches out on a moor in the middle of the day who talk in riddles. He's not going to legitimize it because it sounds like nonsense. But of course, Macbeth does listen to the witches. And right from the start of the play, we see that the great chain of being has been disrupted. A king has been superseded by one of his nobles. And that noble has then taken a whole lot of really immoral actions to ensure that he can shore up his place on the throne. Okay, so the divine right of kings to rule is decided by the family being chosen as special by God. That family then sits at the top of the great chain of being. And the belief was, of course, that if the great chain was preserved, there would be peace and prosperity on earth. When the chain is disrupted by Macbeth killing Duncan and then subsequently killing a number of other people to really highlight that he's an immoral person, the kingdom falls into chaos. And we see this actually manifesting in the play in the behavior of other characters and other creatures who have nothing to do with Macbeth specifically. So, you know, there are storms, there are great tempests at sea, the animals eat each other. There's an eclipse. There are all sorts of portents that suggest that having Macbeth on the throne is problematic, and that ultimately order in the nation cannot be restored while Macbeth is on the throne. Okay, so context of the play. It's important to know that that Shakespeare wrote during the reign of James I. That James I, as a king who came from Scotland and who needed to be legitimised as the ruler of England, needed a story that helped to give him credibility. So he ultimately appears at the end of the play as a good and righteous character, descended from Banquo, who wouldn't listen to witches, who will survive the assassination plots from those within his own country, and who will lead the country to peace and prosperity. Those key words of terminology will be central to understanding, you explaining how the play fits within the broader social context of the time. But as we go through each of these tutorials, I'll give you the terminology most associated with that aspect so that you'll actually end up with a whole big list of words and vocab that you can use to present yourself as a really credible expert on this play. Okay, so if there is something that you would particularly like me to do a tutorial on in relation to Macbeth, to writing your essay, to unpacking essay questions, you know where I am. Please send me an email. I'm more than happy to prepare a tutorial to specifically respond to your needs. But until then, see you later.